U.S. soldiers in Ukraine. Trump makes claim about guarantees for Ukraine and how Trump kickstarts Putin-Zelensky peace summit. We'll talk about this with political analyst, European Leadership Network UK member Alexandra Filippenko. Alexandra, glad to see you and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Alexandra, President Volodymyr Zelensky returned to the White House on Monday to meet U.S. President Donald Trump for fresh talks aimed at ending the war in Ukraine. Several European leaders also flew to Washington to attend the meeting, days after Trump met Russia's dictator Vladimir Putin in Alaska for a summit that failed to result in a ceasefire. How do these talks in Washington fit into Ukrainians' broader diplomatic strategy? What risks does Ukraine face if negotiations stall again?
Well, I must say that there's a stark difference between what we saw in Alaska and what we saw in Washington. First of all, we may say already with almost 100% guarantee that the Alaska talks failed for Donald Trump. Because President Trump, according to Axios and according to different sources, was ready to leave those talks in Alaska because he just saw that his diplomatic efforts do not work when it comes to Vladimir Putin, when it comes to his demands. He didn't change any of his demands. So even though President Trump stayed in the end, but there was no lunch, there were no additional meetings. He only talked to Vladimir Putin and, of course, the representatives of Russia together with Steve Witkoff and Marco Rubio, and then had that anti-press conference. But here, what we saw in Washington now, the story is absolutely different. We see President Trump being quite happy with this united front of the European leaders and headed by President Zelensky, of course. And he didn't even want to end the meeting because we saw and we know that there were scheduled meetings by President Trump with different representatives, including Richard Grenell, that he was supposed to meet, the special envoy of President Trump in Latin America, and he canceled those meetings because he didn't want to conclude meetings with the European leaders and with Volodymyr Zelensky. He didn't want to stop that. And even that call to Vladimir Putin that President Trump made during the European leaders summit in Washington, that call was supposed to happen after they all left. But President Trump didn't let them go. They all stayed. President Trump was happy to answer questions. He was quite easygoing with his time, and he gave everyone a chance to speak. So it's a stark difference with what we saw in Alaska, of course. And of course, it's a stark difference from what we saw in February during the meeting between President Zelensky and President Trump. So now we are hearing and we are seeing that the main thing that was discussed is the NATO-style guarantees, the security guarantees for Ukraine. And I should quote, I think, first of all, what I'm going to say is quote President Zelensky, of course, and he himself said that this was the best meeting yet, although then he said, no, I'm sorry, the best meeting is yet to come, the best meeting is in the future. But what he said to the press is that the main issue that's been discussed, the first, is security guarantees for Ukraine. And now we know that from the United States, those security guarantees for Ukraine are going to be discussed by none other than Marco Rubio, the state secretary and the advisor, the national security advisor to President Trump. And that's extremely important because Marco Rubio is one of, if not the most professional in the Trump administration, the most professional person in the Trump administration. So we are seeing those security guarantees being on the first line, let's say, of discussions. And that stark difference from what we saw in February and, of course, from what we saw in Alaska, too.
About guarantees, as you said, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that Western security guarantees for Ukraine would be formalized within the next week to 10 days, noting that the framework could later be expanded by Kyiv's partners as more details are worked out. Zelensky outlined three main components of the future agreement, so we are waiting for this. And also about territories, because President Volodymyr Zelensky said that the issue of territories will be discussed between him and the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin. He emphasized that such moments are important for Trump to understand the real progress of the armies and the strengths of the armed forces of Ukraine. And Zelensky said, quote, "For example, there are clear figures that did not exist on the map, that in 1,000 days up to 1% of our territory was occupied by Russians. People think it was 20% or 18%, but it was up to 1%. How much does this shift in perspective change the overall understanding of the war's progress and Ukrainians' resilience in Washington?"
Of course, we see a stark change in Washington in general and in the Trump administration, because as we know from different sources, to that meeting in Alaska, Vladimir Putin brought also some maps. And I hope those were not 13th century maps, but we can never be sure when talking about Putin. But Volodymyr Zelensky brought the real map, the reality on the ground. And since we saw, and unfortunately we need to realize that even Steve Witkoff is not really sure about which territories are where, what is region, what is oblast, what is a territory, how is Crimea, do they count Crimea into 4 regions, or is it, it's an additional one? So they're not too precise in the details, and that is the reality of things. So it's extremely important that we saw a map in the Oval Office, the map that showcases not only what's the situation on the ground, but also numbers, percentage. If you look at that map, you will see that there is percentage. How much does the Russian troops hold? How much they occupy of these or that region? And that's very important for President Trump. It was very important for President Trump to see, because this helps realizing that the situation is actually quite different from what Putin is saying. Putin is saying that he controls way more than he actually controls. So this was very important. That's helped that shift. This helped that shift in understanding what is actually happening on the ground. And of course, we see that shift within President Trump. We see that shift within the Trump administration. And I should remind you that J.D. Vance, that was so keen on attacking Volodymyr Zelensky in February during that meeting in the White House, he didn't say a word yesterday. Not a word. It seemed that he wasn't there. But of course, J.D. Vance was there, and as were almost everyone in the top positions of the Trump administration. They were all there. They were all present there. But there is a shift in understanding, first of all, what is happening on the ground, as the Russian side likes to put it, what's the realities on the ground, what's happening, what's actually happening, and what's the situation is potentially for Ukraine, and what's the situation potentially when the European Union and European leaders, not only European Union, because of course we're talking about the United Kingdom also, how the situation is actually when European leaders are eager and ready to help Ukraine, and what they're ready to do, and that they are moving as a united front. That is extremely important in order to change that perspective of Donald Trump, because he saw Ukraine as being, let's say, over there fighting on its own, and European leaders, yes, the coalition of the willing, but how willing is that coalition actually? What is happening? What is going on? There was no united position, and what we saw yesterday is diplomacy at its best. The diplomacy that everyone is talking in sync. Everyone is supporting one another. And that, of course, helped change the perspective in Washington and most importantly of President Trump.
And we also saw that journalist Brian Glenn apologized to Volodymyr Zelensky for his February question about the absence of a suit. And Zelensky joked that the journalist hadn't changed since their last meeting. Also, a good mood, and it's super. About security guarantees, as we mentioned, Russian dictator Vladimir Putin has agreed to provide security guarantees to Ukraine, said US President Donald Trump during a meeting with European leaders. He stated that Putin agreed that Russia would accept security guarantees for Ukraine. This is one of the key points we need to consider. Also, we are going to be considering at the table who will do what. How should we interpret Putin's statement that Russia is ready to accept security guarantees for Ukraine?
The boogeyman for Russia has always been NATO. They've been talking about NATO on the doorstep or NATO potentially attacking Russia. Oh, that was the boogeyman of the 1990s, of 2000s, of the late 90s, of course, because we remember that Yeltsin didn't talk about anything like that, but Putin did. And for Putin, and they're trying to scare the Russian people into thinking that NATO is something extremely dangerous. But European security guarantees is something completely different. It actually can be the same. And as Giorgia Meloni put it, and just look at how she spoke about it. Giorgia Meloni is one of the closest mind readers, I would say, of President Trump. And she used this gesture talking about the NATO-like guarantees. And she said that something to the effect of, Italy actually proposed the Article 5 style guarantees. So actually these are the Article 5 style guarantees, but by the European leaders, not by NATO. That's a no-no for Russia. But NATO-like guarantees by Europe. And in front of our eyes, actually, a very, very important shift is happening. The European Union is turning from the economic alliance, from the trade alliance, into a security alliance, into a military alliance. We haven't seen that in the European leaders. We haven't seen that in the European Union and the UK. We haven't seen that. But now the European Union is reimagining itself as a security alliance, as an intelligence alliance. And that is what we are seeing. That's happening in front of our eyes. And those guarantees should include, as we've heard, peacekeeping force, tens of thousands of troops. That might be quite difficult to attain. That might be quite difficult to get. But peacekeeping force of tens of thousands of troops in Ukraine, European troops, the force a smaller contingent to deter Russia right there on the border, the small contingent, and there we might think about seeing the Americans, not in that huge peacekeeping force of tens of thousands, a small contingent, a small group, but the most lethal one, the most dangerous for anyone who wants to attack Ukraine. And of course, the observer mission, it's the symbolic presence. It's militarily, it might be quite weak, but the observer, this peacekeeping force, yes, of course, it should be there as the observer. But for the Americans, it would be quite difficult to say that boots on the ground are attainable in that big tens of thousands troops force. but in a small contingent, in a smaller contingent, that might be possible. Plus, additionally, of course, the air support potentially, of course, the intelligence support 100%, that we might all see from the American side, and that's expected from the American side. But this all will be decided by the group talking about it and by the group deciding on what is that. And that group from the American side is headed by Marco Rubio. And that's very important because Marco Rubio, the state secretary and the advisor, the national security advisor to the president, knows very well what it's like to communicate with Russia and what it's like to be in front of Russia. So the American side seems to be quite powerful in the idea of the security guarantees, but as everyone has said, all the leaders, and including the United States, that Ukraine most of all needs a strong army and boots on the ground, Ukrainian boots on the ground. The US involvement is a breakthrough, although, yes, details are unclear. But most of all, Ukraine needs a strong army and arms from the United States paid for by the European Union. This is, I think, everyone says the same thing about that. And of course, those security guarantees they do include the strong army in Ukraine.
Dear friends, write your opinion in comments about contingent and about that Russia proposed holding a bilateral meeting at the leaders level first, followed by a trilateral summit involving US President Donald Trump, according to a statement from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. After talks at the White House, Zelensky said that US President Donald Trump had contacted the Russian side to discuss possible diplomatic steps. According to him, Moscow proposed first holding a bilateral meeting between Russia and Ukraine, followed by a trilateral summit. The Ukrainian president stressed that Kyiv was ready to take part in any format at the leaders' level, since only such high-level talks could resolve the most difficult and sensitive issues. What do you think about risks?
Well, the main risk is that Russia will drag its feet again. Will drag its feet, will talking about it. And the Kremlin readout after that call of President Trump with Putin said that the call was frank and constructive. And that's diplomatic code for disagreement. And we didn't hear any confirmation from Putin about negotiations with Zelensky, about meeting Zelensky. Although Marco Rubio, the state secretary, said that United States are working to arrange such talks. And of course, for President Trump, it would be very important to see that happen. But I suppose that Putin, that Russia will try to drag its feet as much as possible, because for Putin, meeting Zelensky is so potentially painful. How many times have Putin and his cronies said that Volodymyr Zelensky is not a legitimate leader of Ukraine, that there are supposed to be elections in Ukraine, pretending as if in Russia there are elections, but fully disregarding the laws of the land. It's the law of the land that there can be no election during a wartime. Of course, there can be nothing. How do you organize an election during wartime? And we all understand that. And Putin is playing with that idea. And for him to legitimize Zelensky is something just as painful as losing Ukrainian land that he already drew into his constitution. So I'm afraid that meeting might be dragged in time. And we all understand that for Putin, this is a chance to attack more, to do more, to move faster. And even during that call with Trump, Putin ordered, or under his orders, new rockets flew to Ukraine, and Ukrainian cities were attacked. right during that call that was so frank and constructive with President Trump. So I'm afraid that that might drag, and maybe not even happen at all in the end. But although when we're talking about Trump, we can understand that he can push Putin into that. He can really affect Putin and make Putin do it. So maybe, and I hope I'll be wrong, I hope I am wrong, and I hope this will happen rather sooner than later. And Volodymyr Zelensky is doing an amazing and just fantastic diplomatic effort at saying that there are no preconditions. I am ready to meet here and now, right now, let's do it now. He's ready to meet whoever and whenever and however it's possible in order to stop the killings of Ukrainians. So this is also a very important gesture for President Trump that he's seeing Volodymyr Zelensky is doing. And we'll see if this really happens. And then, of course, we will see the trilat, as President Trump puts it, and a meeting also, as Emmanuel Macron said, a meeting that would be needed with the European leaders, because Europe, as we now see, is moving together and walking as a united front supporting Ukraine.
French President Emmanuel Macron made a statement emphasizing the need to step up sanctions pressure on Russia if peace talks with Ukraine fail. BFM TV reported the information, and Macron noted that if the current peace negotiations on resolving the war in Ukraine do not yield the desired results, the international community must be ready to take this decisive action. And if peace talks collapse, what kind of US sanctions would be most effective in pressuring Russia, and not only US? Do you believe that Trump is ready to take the political risk for himself of introducing tougher sanctions on Russia? Because we heard about deadlines and nothing.
Yes, deadlines seem to be comfortably forgotten, and all those ultimatums are kind of forgotten right now. Sanctions that would work and that would affect the Russian economy are sanctions on China, because China is the power that is helping Russian economy so much, and China is selling everything to Russia. China is buying everything from Russia. But again, this will definitely affect the Russian economy if there are sanctions on China and China stops, for example, buying Russian oil. But until China stops buying Russian oil, until China does something, so those sanctions would affect American economy. And that is why President Trump is not ready to do that. President Trump does not believe that China will crack under pressure. And Xi Jinping many times have showcased that, yes, okay, China is ready for any additional tariffs. China's economy is ready to withstand it. Okay, no problem, because they understand that they have leverage on the United States. China sells so many goods to the United States. It sends so many goods to the United States. And I'm not only talking about microchips or anything like that, but mainly just day-to-day products that the Americans use, that the Americans buy. And that is what China understands, and that is what President Trump understands. If there is a tariff on Chinese goods, Americans will feel it firsthand. They will feel it. Of course, this will affect Chinese economy. It will be very bad for the Chinese economy, definitely. But maybe China can withstand it for a while, and maybe China will not stop buying Russian oil. So what for will that be? If China is signaling that it will not crack under pressure, it will not stop buying Russian oil, how can the United States actually do it not to suffer themselves? That is what President Trump is trying to figure out. And for now, it doesn't seem like he has an answer. It doesn't seem like he understands how to push China into not buying Russian oil. So that is why he's trying to avoid any sanctions, any sweeping sanctions regarding all countries that are buying Russian resources. Mind you, the sanctions on India don't seem to be canceled. And on August 27th, those additional tariffs of 25% for Indian goods coming to the United States are in effect. Those additional 25% are a go. So we will see how this will work out. This will not affect American economy, Americans' day-to-day life. This will not affect that much. It will, but not that much. But unlike China, China's tariffs would affect Americans' day-to-day life. So now we are having this situation that what really can affect Putin's economy is sanctions on China. President Trump doesn't want to do that. So maybe we will see some different sanctions on Russia, additional sanctions on Russia, additional problems, let's say, for Russia, for Russian economy. Maybe this will not affect it that much, but we might see it, although we might see it from the American side. Really, Emmanuel Macron can also talk from that standpoint, because I'm sure they discussed it. They've discussed it in the White House. But the main thing that could affect Russia and Russian economy is China. And President Trump is trying to do everything not to tariff China.
Alexandra, thank you so much for this important conversation, which really appreciate your time and the valuable thoughts, insights you provided during the interview. I need to say that political analyst, European Leadership Network UK member Alexandra Filippenko was with us today. Alexandra, I wish you all the best and see you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. See you.